Hi, my name is Michael Miz here. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper, F-DETA, a framework for detecting electricity theft attacks in smart grids. So first I'd like to acknowledge the authors of this paper, Varun Krishna, Kiryong Lee, Gabrielle Weaver, Ravi Shankar Iyer, William Sanders, and they're from the Information Trust Institute of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So just going over a quick outline of what we'll be covering in this presentation. So first I'll be giving an introduction onto the problem that's being tackled here, a overview of previous work that's been done, the solution proposed by the authors of this paper, a retrospective application of that solution, and then the results of that retrospective application, and then just covering a couple of key takeaways. So, the smart grid aims to improve the reliability, resiliency, sustainability, and energy efficiency of the existing power grid infrastructure. The advanced metering infrastructure attempts to provide a reliable way for electric utility organizations to monitor power delivery and consumption through electric distribution grids. Although the advanced metering infrastructure was put in place in part to improve security of power grids, the advanced metering infrastructure also opens up new ways for attackers to conduct electricity theft, disruption of power delivery, and even cause damage to the electric delivery infrastructure. In the past, electricity theft were generally carried out by an attacker was generally carried out by an attacker hacking into electric distribution lines. In response, electric utility companies have been encouraging consumers to install smart meters. Although smart meters have become common with the intent of detecting and mitigating electricity theft attacks, it's become clear that these smart meters themselves are vulnerable to malicious exploitation. In 2010, the FBI reported that in Puerto Rico, the underreporting of electricity consumption via smart meter cost electricity utilities approximately $400 million. Other reports also identified the problem to be globally occurring. Overall, electricity theft presents a massive problem in the United States and around the world. World Bank provides a statistic that over 25% of power generated in India, 16% of power generated in Brazil, 6% of power generated in the US and China, and 5% of power generated in Australia is lost due to electricity theft. Bloomberg News reports that this accounts for $17 billion in lost revenue in India alone. Although communication between nodes in the smart grid are generally encrypted and implement methods of tamper detection, the current methods have not demonstrated themselves to be effective methods of deterring attacks on the smart grid. Clearly, attacks on the smart grid, particularly electricity theft, are a major issue for the electric utility companies and for consumers. For consumers, electricity theft is an issue on two fronts. Firstly, because electricity prices are driven up due to the need for electrical companies to make up lost revenue due to theft. Secondly, as I'll discuss later in this presentation, some forms of electricity theft directly affect a neighbor or neighbors of an attacker by decreasing the cost of electricity for the attacker at the expense of others who are typically physically near the attacker. So in past work, strategies for detecting electricity theft have been primarily based on comparing the amount of reported electricity consumption of individuals or groups of individuals to the amount of electricity delivered by electric utilities. Past work has generally relied on machine learning models, specifically anomaly detection methods, to detect and identify cases of electricity theft. These methods have shown some degree of success in detecting such attacks. However, previous research has been generally aimed at detecting specific types of attacks rather than targeting electricity theft in a broad manner. In general, previous articles have failed to make realistic assumptions regarding the common ways electricity is stolen. For example, in many previous papers, assumptions have been made that smart meters have not been compromised. Even in papers when this was not the case and smart meters were assumed to have been compromised, authors of past papers have not made the assumption that attackers have compromised smart meters other than their own. This is a critical assumption, since attacks in which an individual decreases the reported electricity consumption, but increases the electricity consumption of a neighbor to a corresponding degree are not able to be detected by methods presented in the past. Additionally, past methods fail to classify types of attacks. Different types of attacks are not only tend to have different motivations behind them, but are carried out in different ways. I'll discuss the categorization of attacks later in this presentation. At a high level, KL divergence was used to determine the deviation of reported electrical consumption from expected values of reported consumption. KL divergence aims to quantify the deviation of one probability distribution from a baseline probability distribution. The expected values that act as the baseline distribution for the KL divergence measure were derived from the historical data, in a process that will be addressed later in this presentation. In the paper, a standard notation is used to describe the average demand of a consumer during a time period. dC of t is considered to be the average demand of a consumer over the discrete time period of t. The value can be positive, implying power consumption, or negative, implying power generation. However, the value is assumed to be positive unless explicitly stated otherwise. dC prime of t is considered to be the average reported demand of a consumer over the discrete time period of t. A key takeaway here is that where dC of t is not equal to dC prime of t, it is assumed that there is either theft occurring or smart meters and/or network communications are malfunctioning. Lambda t represents the price of electricity at time t. The units of the aforementioned variables are dC of t and dC prime of t correspond to units of kilowatts, and lambda t corresponds to units of dollars per kilowatt hour. Since the solution presented in this paper aims at being widely inclusive regarding electricity theft attacks performed through smart meter misreporting, several pricing strategies were addressed, namely flat rate pricing, time of use pricing, and real-time pricing. In flat rate pricing, the price stays the same for all discrete time units of t over a period of time. In time of use pricing, the price fluctuates in a discrete manner according to the time of day consumption. The authors note that there tend to be three main prices for time of use pricing, specifically peak pricing, partial peak, and off-peak pricing. Finally, in real-time pricing, the prices change according to the current demand of all consumers in the market. That is, the demand of if the demand of electricity is high at a given time, the price increases in response and vice versa. The authors note that generally, attackers can steal electricity either by manually tapping electrical power lines or by electronically injecting false readings into smart meters. It's noted that the proposed solution here aims at specifically mitigating the latter method of attack. An attack is defined as satisfying the basic conditions shown by equation 1. Simply, the equation states that the sum of reported consumption must be less than the sum of actual consumption over some time period big T. Otherwise, the attacker has not stolen electricity. This is true whether or not the attacker is generating or consuming electricity. The authors of this paper propose a solution which addresses many of the aforementioned shortcomings of previous work. Namely, the solution assumes that the attacker has not compromised their own smart meter, but the smart meters of others in their network as well. To make this point more understandable, the graph shown in this slide represents a possible network topology. In the graph, the nodes C1 through C5 represent the consumption of individual consumers. L2 and L3 represent the power loss due to inherent inefficiencies such as line resistance. N2 and N3 represent balance nodes, which measure the consumption of subnetworks, which would equal the sum of consumption from consumers C1, C2, and C3, and consumers C4 and C5 respectively, as well as their associated electrical power losses. The nodes N2 and N3 both fall in the network stemming from nodes N1, and have inherent power losses described by L1. This is ultimately described by equation 4 shown above. Thus, in the paper, if an attacker is represented by node C2, it is assumed that it is also possible the attacker has compromised smart meters at nodes C1 and C3, as well as their own smart meter reporting the electrical consumption at C2. It's also important to note that it is assumed that the attackers have not compromised or modified the perceived electrical losses of the power grid. The authors felt that this was a safe assumption to make, since the electrical losses are stated to be pre-calculated values through specifications of wire gauge and assumed electrical impedance rather than measured values. Equation 5 represents what industry currently uses as a balance check to determine whether electricity theft has occurred or not. Summarily, the equation states that if the sum of the reported consumption of consumer nodes plus the sum of the line losses are not equal to the reported consumption at the balance node, then electricity theft has not occurred in the subnetwork reporting to the balance node. The authors of this paper note that although industry currently relies on this standard to determine whether electricity theft has occurred, the assumption is incorrect, since Mallory may compensate for her underreporting of electrical consumption by overreporting the consumption of another node within her subnetwork. Equation 6 represents the combination of equation 4 shown in the previous slide and equation 5 shown here, and offers an equivalent but more concise equation for the present balance checking, which authors argue is insufficient for reliable detection of electricity theft. Using this balance check method, the faulty or malicious smart meter can be effectively localized, assuming the attack type does not circumvent balance checking. Assume W represents the condition that a node fails a balance check. That is, if W is true for node 2, N2, then N2 has failed a balance check. If a node fails a balance check, all of its parents' node up until the roots will also necessarily fail that balance check. So, if W is true for node N2, then it is also true for node N1. Thus, by tracing a balance check failure down to the lowest level of failure, the node to investigate can be localized. If the localized node is determined to be functioning properly, then it can be assumed that electricity has been stolen. Ultimately, localization of a node using balance check method results in a worst-case search order in big O notation of O to the N. Electricity theft attacks are categorized into 7 categories in this paper. Namely 1A, 2A, 3A, and 1B, 2B, 3B, and 4B. Some implications of each attack type are listed here on Table 1 shown on the slide. For all cases of attacks, Equation 7 must hold. That is, the attacker must consume more electricity than they ultimately pay for. Attack Class 1 represents an attack where the left-hand side of the Equation 7 is not varied. Instead, the right-hand side of the Equation 7 is artificially increased. This means that Mallory increases her consumption of electricity, but the amount of electricity consumption she reports remains the same. Alternatively, Attack Class 2A represents an attack where the right-hand side of Equation 7 remains static. Instead, the left-hand side of the equation is decreased, which implies that Mallory has not changed her consumption of electricity, but the amount that she reports she consumes has decreased. The authors note that the potential of this attack is bounded by the amount of electricity Mallory typically consumes, and is thus more limited in terms of how much electricity can be stolen in comparison to Attack Class 1A. Attack Class 3A is not possible for a fixed rate pricing scheme. This is because the attack method described in 3A is done by Mallory shifting her reported time of consumption rather than the amount of electricity she actually used. For example, Mallory may underreport her electricity consumption during peak pricing times and overreport her consumption of electricity during off-peak pricing times. So attack classes 1B through 4B represent attack classes that circumvent traditional balance checkings that were previously described. Equation 8 describes how Mallory is able to circumvent the balance check described through equations 4, 5, and 6. In this equation, dA of t represents the electrical demand of Mallory, dN of t represents the electrical demand of Mallory's neighbors, and both variables' primes versions represents their reported value. In this case, the reported consumption of Mallory does not have to be equal to the actual consumption for the balance check to be satisfied. Instead, Mallory is able to increase the reported consumption of one or more of her neighbors to account for the increase of her own reported consumption, for the decrease in her own reported consumption. Excuse me. This highlights the major shortcoming of the current balance check method currently used in industry. Attack classes 1B through 3B correspond to attack classes 1A through 3A, with the additional step of Mallory over-reporting one or more of her neighbors' consumptions to circumvent the balance check. Attack class 4B is a bit more unique than the other 6 attack classes. In this attack, Mallory leverages a system equipped with automated demand response, or ADR. ADR is applicable in real-time pricing. An ADR system adjusts a consumer's consumption of electricity in response to the current demand of electricity in a real-time pricing scheme. Generally, ADRs decrease the electricity consumed in a manner linearly proportional to the current price of electricity. Mallory leverages this system by decreasing her neighbor's electrical demand by increasing the electrical price seen by the neighbor's ADR system. Mallory increases her own consumption proportionally to the neighbor's artificially decreased consumption at an artificially discounted price. Interestingly, attack class 4B results in the affected neighbors seeing a power bill which may be less than they expected. However, in reality, this is because their system was forced to consume less electricity. In reality, Mallory has a positive net gain at the neighbor's expense. Mallory's attacks can be any one or any combination of previously mentioned attack categories. Thus, the authors argue that a sufficient solution should address all of these categories rather than just targeting one or a subset of the categories. This is in contrast to previous work, which generally aims at detecting subsets of electricity theft attacks by compromising a smart meter. Thus, the authors present F-DETA framework, which is the acronym for Framework for Detecting Electricity Theft Attacks. However, the authors fall short of their own statement, as the solution is aimed at addressing only attack classes 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, and 3B. They state that since attack classes 1A, 2A, and 3A can be detected through the current balance check method, there's no real reason to focus on addressing these classes. The authors state that they did not address attack class 4B primarily because they have no supporting data for ADR systems. This general framework covers a 5-step process. Namely, estimate the expected consumption of all consumers for the time period in question, evaluate whether the observed readings are anomalous when compared to the expected readings, identify whether the anomalous readings indicate that the consumer is an attacker or a victim, assess counterarguments as to why a reading may be anomalous, such as weather events or holidays, and then investigate the anomaly. Although the authors of this paper rely on KL divergence to determine whether the observed readings are anomalous in comparison to the expected readings, they note that this is simply one of the many methods that may work in identifying electricity theft within the F-DETA framework. In order to apply their solution on a retrospective dataset, the authors made several key assumptions. The authors noted that their algorithm was intended to run at an electric utilities control center. The authors also made the assumption that the smart meter readings that are reported to the utility perform accurate measurements. They justified this assumption by referencing a study that indicated that 99.96% of electronic smart meter readings were within plus or minus 2% of their actual value, and that 99.91% of meter values were within plus or minus 0.5% of their actual value. They noted that although the measurements are accurate, the reported readings may have been compromised by an attacker. The authors also assumed that the root node is the only balance check meter that can be trusted to have not been compromised by an attacker. The authors note that they had previously devised an anomaly detection method requiring only a fixed model and a single new reading. The model they used for this purpose was an autoregressive integrating moving average ARIMA model. In this method, previous readings are used to determine the expected future values through use of moving averages. If a new observation deviated substantially outside the bounds determined by the ARIMA model, the new reading is considered to be anomalous. The authors point out that they were able to conceive of and construct an attack that they dubbed the integrated ARIMA attack that circumvents this method of anomaly detection. As a response to the shortcoming of the ARIMA model to detect such an attack, the authors introduced the KL divergence-based model that relies on a series of readings rather than identifying a single reading that deviates substantially from an expected value. Within the KL divergence-based method of anomaly detection, a baseline or expected reading value is constructed for each consumer. For each consumer, a training matrix denoted X is constructed with M rows, where each row represents a week of previously observed readings in the training set. The elements within each row of the training set represent the electrical consumption of a user for a discrete time window during that week. A histogram consisting of B bins is then considered for each user. The histogram represents what is referred to as the X distribution. Finally, considering each of the weeks in the training set for each user, the discrete probability of occurrence according to the X distribution for the user of each element is calculated. These resulting probabilities are referred to as the XI distribution. To quantify the abnormality of the observed week of data for a user, a measure denoted the KLD distribution is calculated, shown in equation 12. The denominator in the log term of the equation, Px superscript j, represents the number of times a value from the X distribution fell within the bin j, normalized by the total number of values in the X distribution. The numerator term, Px subscript I superscript j, represents the number of times a value from the Xi distribution fell within bin j, normalized by the total number of values in the Xi distribution. The complete equation provides a quantifiable measure of the deviation of distributions between the expected value represented by the baseline X distribution and the single week's Xi distribution. As the magnitude of this measure increases, the confidence that the associated week is anomalous also increases. This measure is then used to identify anomalies in an unsupervised manner. The authors assess two thresholds for detecting anomalies, namely thresholds set at the 90th and 95th percentile of the KLD distributions. That is, if a measured divergence for some user on some week exceeds the previously mentioned thresholds, the observations are determined to be anomalous. This measure extends for weeks outside of the training set simply by replacing the Xi distribution with a new week vector denoted Xa. The lower the threshold boundary, the more aggressive the decision boundary is in determining anomalies. That is to say that the 90th percentile threshold is more aggressive than the 95th percentile threshold. Although this should result in higher number of identified anomalies, this also increases the false positive rate. Though the authors make no mention of it, in this paper, use of an ROC curve would be appropriate in determining the ideal anomaly decision threshold if a sufficient sample of previously identified anomalies exists. The dataset used during retrospective application of F-DETA was collected in Ireland's Commission for Energy Regulation. In total, 74 weeks of data were used, 60 of which comprised the training set, with the remaining 14 weeks making up the testing set. The dataset contained information on a set of 500 consumers made up of 404 residential consumers, 36 small and medium enterprises, and 60 unclassified consumers. Results were assessed in a consideration of 3 anomaly detection models: an ARIMA-based detector, a modified integrated ARIMA-based detector, and the proposed KLD detector. The authors randomly inject attack classes 1B, 2B, 3B, 2A, and 3A into the dataset. The authors note that the importance of injecting these attacks in a way that deterministic patterns are not produced, since these patterns may be capitalized on by models trying to identify these attacks. As a reminder, attack class 1B implies that Mallory has increased her own consumption, but does not increase her reported amount of electricity consumed. Instead, Mallory overreports her neighbor's consumption of electricity to circumvent the balance checking. Attack classes 2A and 2B imply Mallory keeps her consumption consistent, but decreases the reported electricity consumption. Her reported electricity consumption. In 2A, this is all that the attack consists of. In 2B, Mallory circumvents balance checking once again by over-reporting her neighbor's consumption. Attack classes 3A and 3B implies Mallory has shifted her reported time of consumption to periods when electricity is less costly, while in reality she may be consuming electricity during peak hours. During this attack injection, peak and off-peak periods of electricity costs are assumed, and the authors swap Mallory's consumption of electricity during these two periods. Once again, the 3B version of this attack circumvents balance checking, whereas 3A does not. While injecting these attacks, the authors make the assumption that if Mallory is capable of compromising smart meters, she's also capable of monitoring smart meters with the intent of keeping her attacks unnoticed by countermeasures. Since Mallory is able to carry out attacks while taking into account her neighbors and her own measured consumption, Mallory is able to circumvent the ARIMA and generally integrated ARIMA detector as shown in the plots above. Notice that in all three plots, Mallory's attack is able to stay within the 95% confidence bounds of the ARIMA detector, thus remaining undetected. Also note that in the far right plot, Mallory has gained a monetary advantage by shifting her reported consumption, represented by the dashed red line denoted attack vector, into the off-peak period, whereas much of her actual consumption occurs during the peak period pricing. Two primary metrics were taken into account. Metric 1 was defined as the percentage of consumers for whom the detector successfully detected an injected attack. Metric 2 is defined as the maximum amount of electricity stolen in kilowatt hours as a result of an undetected attack. Monetary gain was also derived from metric 2, while considering peak pricing of 21 cents per kilowatt hour from 9 a.m. to midnight and an off-peak pricing of 18 cents per kilowatt hour from midnight to 9 a.m. Time of use pricing was used instead of real-time pricing, since time of use is a more widespread pricing scheme, and more realistic assumptions are able to be made. In regards to metric 1, the KLD detector demonstrated superior performance in comparison to the ARIMA and the integrated ARIMA detectors. This was true of all injected attack classes. This is also true of metric 2, although the results appear to be dramatically in favor of using the KLD detector over the ARIMA-based detector. I feel that it is important to note that the attacks that were injected while considering Mallory was aware of ARIMA-based countermeasures of detection. In my personal opinion, this is a somewhat biased assumption which skews the comparative results strongly in favor of the KLD detector. So just a few key takeaways. In consideration of this research, I feel it's worth mentioning these. Firstly, electricity theft is a global and very expensive problem. The authors do a great job of pointing out some of the shortcomings of existing solutions and research methods in tackling this problem. Secondly, the authors present F-DETA, a framework for detecting electricity theft attacks. They also demonstrate that this framework proves to be effective in detecting a relatively wide array of attack types. Additionally, these attack types are classified and summarized by their methods, motivations, and practical limitations. Lastly, the authors demonstrate that within the F-DETA framework, KL divergence-based methods of identifying anomalies show a high degree of promise in detecting electricity theft attacks. Once again, I'd like to thank the team at the Information Trust Institute of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for their excellent work, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.